What does it mean to prepare for a storm that could erase your home from the earth? What kind of knowledge must you carry in your bones when winter stretches across 7 months of darkness, cold so deep it splits trees open like dried fruit, and winds that reshape the landscape while you sleep? Tonight, we drift backward through time to the Siberian frontier of the 18th and 19th centuries, to a land where survival was not guaranteed by walls alone. Here, in the vast taiga forests where temperatures plunged to 40 degrees below freezing, early settlers learned a truth that the land taught slowly, carefully, and sometimes with terrible cost. Your cabin, no matter how solid, no matter how carefully chinked and roofed, might not be enough. Before we step into this quiet journey through winter's iron grip on the Siberian frontier, I'd like to ask a small favor. If you tap the like button and subscribe to Epic Boring History, you'll join us for more of these midnight passages through forgotten corners of the past. Leave a comment if you'd like. Tell me where you are right now, what time it is in your part of the world. Some of you may be listening in the deep hours of night, others just beginning your day, and some somewhere quietly in between. Dim the lights if you wish, perhaps turn on a gentle fan for that soft, steady hum. Now let's settle in together for tonight's slow drift into history. The stories we'll follow tonight are not of great battles or famous names. They are quieter than that, more persistent, woven into the daily rhythm of ordinary lives lived at the edge of what the human body can endure. We'll walk through the preparations, the small adjustments, the unspoken fears. We'll feel the texture of frost on wooden handles, the weight of snow accumulating on a roof through the long night, the particular silence that comes before a storm arrives in full force. You'll meet people who learn to read the sky like a book written in shades of grey. You'll understand why they built hidden shelters beneath the snow and earth, chambers carved into hillsides or dug beneath the frozen ground, places they hoped never to use, but prepared with the same care they gave to anything that might save a life. These were not grand structures, they were not spoken of with pride or recorded in official documents. They were simply there, waiting in the darkness, a second home beneath the first. And tonight, you'll learn why. Imagine yourself standing at the edge of a settlement so remote that the nearest town lies 3 days' journey through forest, so dense the snow never fully melts between the trees, even in summer. The year might be 1760 or 1820 or any winter in between, it hardly matters, because winter here operates outside the measurements of calendars and clocks. This is the Siberian taiga, a landscape that extends in all directions like a cold ocean made of pine and birch and larch. The trees stand so thick in places that you can walk for hours, seeing nothing but their dark trunks receding into white mist. Your home is a log cabin, built with your own hands and the hands of neighbors who knew that survival here meant shared labor. The logs were cut green and allowed to settle, then chinked with moss gathered from the forest floor and mixed with clay from the riverbank when the ground thawed enough to dig. The roof is layered birch bark beneath split logs, heavy enough to hold against wind, but vulnerable to the weight of snow. Every autumn you inspect it, replace weak sections, pray it will hold through another season. But you know, as everyone here knows, that sometimes roofs collapse. Sometimes walls shear away from their foundations when the wind hits from an unexpected angle. Sometimes the chimney clogs with ice and smoke fills the cabin like a slow-moving fog, thick and choking, and you must make a choice in seconds, stay and suffocate, or flee into cold that can kill you just as surely. Winter here is not one danger, but many, layered and waiting. Your day begins in darkness because for much of the winter, true daylight lasts only a few hours. You rise when you can no longer bear the cold of lying still, your breath visible even inside the cabin despite the fire that burned low through the night. Through the The first task is always the fire. You feed it carefully with wood you carried inside the night before, wood you split and stacked weeks ago, part of preparations that began in late summer and never truly end. The wood must be dry. Wet wood smokes without giving sufficient heat, and smoke is its own kind of torture in a space this small, this sealed against the cold. You dress in layers, linen against the skin, then wool, then leather, then furs. Your hands shake slightly as you tie the fastenings, because the cold has already worked its way into your fingers despite the fire now crackling with more strength. Outside, the world is blue-grey in the pre-dawn light. Snow lies deep enough that the fence posts are buried, only their tips visible, like dark fingers reaching up from beneath a white blanket. The path to the woodshed must be cleared again. You cleared it yesterday and the day before, and you will clear it again tomorrow. This is the rhythm of winter, the same tasks repeated endlessly, because snow does not stop falling and wind does not stop drifting it into new shapes. Your breath freezes in your beard if you are a man, or on the scarf wrapped around your face if you are a woman. Ice crystals form on the wool, catching what little light filters through the clouds. The livestock must be tended. You keep them close in winter, chickens in a small shelter attached to the cabin, a goat or cow, if you are fortunate enough to have one, housed in a lean-to structure that shares a wall with your living space so that their body heat might add some small warmth to your own. They are hungry, always hungry. Their feed was gathered in summer, dried grasses and stored roots carefully rationed, because it must last until spring. And spring is so far away, it exists only as an idea, a memory of a feeling you once had. The air outside burns in your lungs. At 40 degrees below freezing, each breath is an act of controlled violence against your own body. You learn not to breathe deeply. You learn to take small sips of air through the scarf, to move slowly despite the urgency of tasks, because hurrying means breathing harder, and breathing harder means pain. Your eyelashes stick together when you blink. You must wipe them with your glove, carefully, because if they freeze together fully, you will have to warm them with your hand before you can open your eyes again. This has happened to you before. You do not let it happen often now. The forest around the settlement is not silent. That is a myth people tell who have never stood in a winter forest. It groans and cracks as the cold works deeper into the wood. Trees split with sounds like gunshots, sudden and sharp enough to make your heart race. Ice shifts and settles with creaks that seem to come from everywhere and nowhere. The wind, when it blows, does not howl romantically as in stories. It roars, a physical force that pushes against you, that finds every gap in your clothing and pours cold through it like water through a sieve. But today, this morning, there is no wind. The air is perfectly still. This stillness is not peaceful. You have lived here long enough to know that stillness like this means something is coming. The sky has a particular quality, a flatness to its grey colour, as though the clouds have pressed down lower, closer to the earth. The sun, when it rises enough to be visible, is a pale disk without warmth, a ghost of itself. You pause in your work, a load of firewood balanced in your arms, and you look at that sky. Your neighbour, an older man who has survived 30 winters in this place, steps out of his cabin and looks up as well. You do not need to speak. You both know what this sky means. A storm is building somewhere beyond sight, gathering its strength in the vast emptiness to the north. It will arrive tonight, or tomorrow, or the day after. Winter storms here do not announce their schedules precisely, but they announce themselves in these subtle ways: the quality of light, the behavior of air, the feeling in your bones. The dogs are restless. They pace and whine and will not settle, though you have fed them their usual portions. Animals know before people do, always, and they lack the human capacity for denial, for hoping that maybe this time will be different. The birds have already gone, you realize. Yesterday there were still a few ravens calling from the treetops, but today the forest is empty of them. Your wife comes to the door and asks if you have seen the sky. You tell her yes. She asks if you think it will be a bad one. You tell her you do not know, but you will prepare as though it will be. This is the unspoken agreement between all of you who live here. Prepare for the worst, hope for the survivable. The worst is always possible. You begin the preparations that have become ritual, movements practiced so many times they require no thought, only the steady application of will against the seduction of hoping you will not need to do this, not this time. First, you check the cabin roof. This means climbing up with a long pole and carefully testing the snow load, judging by feel and sound whether the timbers beneath are stressed, whether any section sags more than it should. The cold makes the wood brittle. A roof that would flex and hold in autumn might crack and collapse in deep winter under the same weight. You find one section that concerns you and you climb up, carefully, always carefully, because a fall from a roof in winter can mean death from injury or from lying in snow unable to move while cold takes you. You shovel snow from that section, throwing it down in heavy chunks that land with soft thuds in the deep drifts below. Your arms burn with the effort. Your shoulders ache. You have been doing heavy labor since before dawn, and it is not yet midday. There is so much more to do. Next, the chimney. You climb up once more with a long brush made of bundled twigs and push it down the chimney shaft, scraping away any ice buildup, any accumulation that might block the flow of smoke when you need the fire burning hottest. A blocked chimney in a storm means a choice between freezing and suffocating. You have heard stories of families found dead in spring, huddled together in a cabin filled with smoke, unable to see that death was coming from their own fire. You check the windows, small openings covered with oiled parchment or, if you were lucky enough to trade for it, precious glass. The shutters must close tightly and latch from the inside. In the strongest winds, even shuttered windows can burst inward if the pressure difference is great enough. You have seen it happen. Glass or parchment exploding into a room, wind and snow pouring through like a living thing. You test each latch. You pack the edges with strips of leather and cloth for additional seal. The door must open inward, never outward, because snow can pile against it during a storm until it cannot be pushed open from inside. You have heard of people trapped in their homes by snow against the door, slowly running out of firewood, slowly freezing in place with freedom just inches away. You check the hinges, you check the bar that holds it shut. Everything must work perfectly because there will be no second chances, no time to repair things once the storm arrives in full strength. But you know, everyone here knows, that sometimes cabins fail anyway. Sometimes the preparations are not enough. There are stories told on long winter nights, stories everyone has heard, stories that serve as warnings. The family whose roof collapsed in the night, burying them in snow and timber. The man whose cabin wall split from its foundation, letting the storm in like a flood. The widow who burned all her furniture for warmth when her woodpile ran out, then burned the walls themselves, then died anyway when there was nothing left to burn. These stories are not told for entertainment. They are told so that no one forgets what is possible. And this is why, over generations of hard learning, settlers here developed a second strategy, a backup plan that exists beneath the first, the hidden shelter. The place you hope never to use but prepare with the same care you give to anything that might save your life. It is not large, perhaps 8 feet across, 6 feet deep, carved into the side of a low hill or dug straight down into earth that was frozen when you started and had to be thawed section by section, with fire and hot stones. The walls are lined with birch bark to keep earth from crumbling inward. The roof is low, made of logs covered with bark, and then earth and then snow, indistinguishable from the hillside around it, except for a small entrance, barely large enough to crawl through, hidden among the trees and marked only by signs you have taught your family to recognize. Inside, the floor is layered with straw and furs. There is a small store of firewood, very dry, chosen for burning with minimal smoke. There is a skin of water, sealed and wrapped to keep from freezing solid. There is dried meat and dried fish and hard bread that will keep indefinitely in the cold. There are blankets and extra furs and a small lamp that burns fish oil. There is a knife and a fire-starting kit and a small iron pot. There is space for your family to huddle together, lying down or sitting hunched, waiting for the storm to pass. It is not comfortable. It is not meant to be comfortable. It is meant to keep you alive when everything else has failed. You maintain this shelter as carefully as you maintain your cabin, perhaps more so, because it exists for a single purpose: survival when all other options are gone. Every few days in winter, you must clear snow from the entrance. You must check that the ventilation holes, small tunnels carved at angles through the earth, opening some distance away, remain open. Without airflow, the shelter becomes a suffocation trap. With too much airflow, it becomes too cold to survive. The balance is delicate. You must rotate the food supplies using the oldest and replacing it with fresh provisions, because even dried food can spoil or be invaded by mice or simply lose its nutritional value. You must check the firewood for dampness, for mold, for any sign that it will not burn cleanly when needed. You must ensure that everyone in the family knows where it is and how to reach it in darkness, in blowing snow, in panic. You have practiced this, walking from the cabin to the shelter with your eyes closed, counting steps, memorizing the feel of the path under your feet. Your children have practiced it. Even the youngest knows if father says to go to the hidden place, you go immediately. You do not stop for possessions. You do not ask questions. The work of maintaining the shelter is work that yields no visible result when things go well. It is work done against a possibility, a fear, a scenario you hope will remain hypothetical. But you do it anyway every time, because winter here does not reward hope. It rewards preparation. As the day progresses and the light begins its early fade into afternoon darkness, you make a decision. The sky has not changed, but that is precisely what concerns you. It should have changed by now, one way or another. This frozen stillness, this waiting quality in the air, has stretched too long. You tell your wife to pack the emergency bags, one for her to carry, one for you, small packs with the absolute essentials, fire-starting materials, a knife, dried food, an extra blanket. She does not question this. She has been married to you for 12 years, and she has learned to trust your reading of winter's moods. Your children watch with wide eyes as you make these preparations. They are old enough to understand what it means, but young enough to still feel excitement mixed with their fear. To them, going to the hidden shelter is an adventure, a break from routine. You do not correct this feeling. Let them have their innocence for as long as winter allows. You check your supplies once more: water, food, firewood, lamp oil, blankets. Everything is there. Everything is as ready as human effort can make it. And still you feel the gnawing uncertainty, the knowledge that you may have forgotten something, that there may be some preparation you have not made, some weakness you have not shored up. This feeling never goes away, no matter how many winters you survive. Perhaps it is what keeps you alive, this refusal to feel fully confident, this constant second-guessing that drives you to check and recheck and check once more. The dogs are pacing more urgently now. One of them, the oldest, begins to dig at the snow near the cabin wall, a frantic scrabbling that serves no purpose you can identify. Your neighbor emerges from his cabin again and crosses the space between your homes. His face is grim. He asks if you are preparing the shelter. You tell him yes. He tells you he is doing the same. His son, he says, thinks he is being foolish, that the cabin has survived worse storms than this. You both know what this means. The son is young, has survived only 6 or 7 winters here, does not yet have the deep knowledge that comes from decades of watching, waiting, preparing. The son still believes that walls are enough. You do not say this aloud. You simply nod, and your neighbor nods back, and he returns to his preparations. Night comes early, as it always does in deep winter. By mid-afternoon, the world is dark except for the blue glow of snow under starlight. But tonight, there are no stars. The clouds have thickened, pressed down even lower, and the darkness is complete, absolute. You light lamps inside the cabin and check the fire once more. You feed it well, building it high, because you do not know how long you will be able to keep it burning. You bring all the firewood from outside into the cabin, stacking it along the walls until there is barely room to move. You check the livestock one final time, giving them extra feed, extra water. If the storm is truly bad, you may not be able to reach them for days. They may die. This is a possibility you must accept, because you cannot save everything, and people come first. Your wife has prepared a hot meal, perhaps the last hot meal for some time. You eat together as a family, sitting close around the table, and you do not speak of what might come. Instead, you speak of small things, a story one of the children heard from a neighbor, a plan to build a new shed in spring, a hope that the trapping will be good this year. These small conversations are their own kind of prayer, an insistence on continuity, on the assumption of a future. After the meal, you do not immediately prepare for sleep. Instead, you sit by the fire and you listen. The wind has begun. It is still far away, a distant sound like breathing, but it is there, and it is coming closer. You can feel it in the air pressure, a weight against your eardrums, a sensation that makes you want to yawn to clear them. The dogs have finally settled, but they lie with their heads up, ears alert, watching the door. Your wife sits beside you, mending a shirt by lamplight, her needle moving in steady rhythm. She does not speak, but you feel her presence as a comfort, a reminder that you are not facing this alone. The children have been sent to bed, though you doubt they are sleeping. You can hear the soft rustle of their movements in the loft above, the whispered conversation between them. Let them whisper. Let them have this time of not quite fear, this waiting that is not yet crisis. The wind grows louder. Now you can hear it clearly, a rising moan that seems to come from all directions at once. The cabin begins to creak, not alarmingly, not yet, but you hear the subtle shifts in the wood, the small adjustments as it braces itself against the pressure. Snow begins to fall, not gently, but in a thick curtain that you can hear hissing against the walls. You rise and check the door once more. You check the windows. You climb the ladder to the loft and look at your children, their faces pale in the lamplight, and you tell them that if you say it is time to go, they must move quickly and without question. They nod, solemn now, fear beginning to overcome excitement. You descend the ladder and return to your place by the fire. Your wife has put aside her mending. She asks if you think it will be tonight. You tell her you do not know, but you are ready. The wind rises to a howl. The cabin shudders. Snow drives against the walls with a sound like thrown sand, a constant hissing roar that drowns out all other sounds. The fire flickers despite being well inside the chimney, as though the wind has found its way down the shaft. You feed the fire more wood. You do not let it burn low. The pressure against your ears intensifies. Something outside, a tree branch perhaps, or a loose board from someone's shed, crashes against the cabin wall with a bang that makes everyone jump. Your wife's hand finds yours in the darkness beyond the fire's light. Her grip is strong. The children have gone silent in the loft above. You can feel they're listening, they're waiting. The wind pauses for a moment, a sudden stillness that is somehow more frightening than the noise. In that stillness, you hear a cracking sound, distant but unmistakable, a tree coming down somewhere in the forest. Then the wind returns, stronger than before, a sustained roar that seems to shake the very air inside the cabin. The walls groan, the roof timbers creak. You look up, trying to see through the darkness of the loft to the roof above, trying to judge by sound alone whether it is holding. And then you hear it, a different sound, a wrong sound, a splintering crack that seems to come from the roof's center. Your wife hears it too. Her hand tightens on yours. You move quickly now, no longer waiting. You call to the children to come down immediately. You grab the emergency packs. Your wife is already wrapping the youngest child in furs, moving with the swift efficiency of practiced fear. You do not take time to gather more. You do not stop to save possessions or put out the fire or close up the cabin properly. You open the door. It fights you, the wind trying to tear it from your hands, and snow blasts in like water through a broken dam. The cold hits you like a physical blow, stealing your breath. But you push through it, your family behind you, and you begin to move through the storm toward the hidden place that waits in the darkness, the shelter that you built for this moment, the second home beneath the snow that will hold you through the night while the storm devours the world above. The path is invisible now, buried under new snow and obscured by wind-driven whiteness. But your feet remember the way, and you count the steps as you practiced. 20 straight ahead, 15 to the left, 30 more at an angle uphill. Your children are crying, but you can barely hear them over the wind. Your wife follows close behind, one hand on your back, so she will not lose you in the whiteout. You reach the place where the entrance should be. You drop to your knees and begin to dig through fresh snow, feeling with your hands for the shape you know is there. Your fingers, already numb, scrape against wood. You have found it. You clear the entrance with desperate speed, throwing snow aside until you can see the dark opening. You push your children inside one by one, hearing them drop down into the darkness below. Your wife follows. You take one last look back toward where your cabin stands invisible in the storm, and then you lower yourself into the earth, pulling the entrance cover closed above you, sealing yourself into the hidden shelter's darkness. For a moment there is only your breathing, harsh and loud in the confined space. Then someone lights the lamp, and the small chamber fills with weak, flickering light. Your family is here, all of you, huddled together in a space barely large enough to hold you. The storm roars above, but its sound is muffled now, distant, held back by earth and wood, and the careful construction of this hidden place. You are cold, soaked with snow that is already melting from your clothes. You are frightened, uncertain whether your cabin is still standing or has already collapsed. But you are alive and together, and for now, for this moment, that is enough. You begin the work of making the shelter warm, of preparing to wait out the storm, of settling into the particular discomfort of survival that will stretch through the long hours ahead. This is what it means to face winter here. Not courage, not heroism, but this constant small struggle, this endless preparation for disaster, this knowledge that your life depends on work done yesterday, last week, last autumn, every moment of care and labor that brought you to this cold darkness where your family breathes and waits and hopes for morning. Let us drift now from the immediacy of storm and shelter into the quieter current of a single life, a man whose name appears in only a handful of records, but whose work shaped survival across the Siberian frontier for generations. His name was Stepan Alexeyevich, though in the scattered settlements where he worked, people called him simply the Builder, and later, in his old age, the one who listens to winter. He was born in 1747 in a settlement so small it had no official name, only a cluster of cabins along a frozen river that ran fast in spring and slow in winter. His father was a woodworker, not by choice but by necessity, as all men here learned to work with wood or failed to survive. His mother came from further east, from a family that had traded with the Evenki people for 2 generations. And from her came the knowledge that would later define Stepan's life, the understanding that survival in winter meant learning from those who had survived here longest. She spoke some Evenki phrases, knew their methods for reading weather and snow, and passed these fragments of knowledge to her son, as other mothers passed on recipes or prayers. Stepan was the 3rd of 5 children, and only 3 lived past their 10th year. This was not remarkable. This was simply the arithmetic of frontier life, where winter and disease and accident subtracted steadily from every family's count. The deaths were not dramatic. They were quiet, almost administrative in their inevitability. A fever that would not break, a fall through river ice, a coughing sickness that moved through the settlement one autumn and took the weakest children before spring. Stepan learned young that life was not a guarantee but a series of careful negotiations with cold, hunger, and chance. He learned to be methodical, to check his work twice, to trust nothing to assumption. At 9 years old, he experienced the storm that would shape every decision he made thereafter. It came in late November, earlier than expected, with a ferocity that caught the settlement unprepared. The sky had warned them, but not everyone had read the warnings correctly. Some had dismissed the signs as the prelude to an ordinary storm, the kind that comes and goes and leaves people tired but alive. Stepan's family had retreated to their cabin and barred the door and kept the fire burning high. They survived, though the roof sagged and creaked through 2 days of wind and snow so thick the world beyond the walls simply ceased to exist. But their neighbor, a man named Pavel, who had always been kind to Stepan, who had taught him to set snares and identify animal tracks, did not survive. His cabin's roof had been damaged in an earlier storm, weakened in ways not visible from outside, and under the weight of new snow it collapsed inward during the night. Pavel and his wife were found 3 days later when the storm finally broke, buried under timber and snow, frozen in positions that suggested they had tried to dig their way out. Stepan saw their bodies when they were carried past his cabin, wrapped in canvas, faces covered. He did not cry. He was 9 years old and had already learned that tears were a private thing, saved for darkness. But something hardened in him that day, a determination that crystallized around a single thought. There must be a better way. People should not die because a roof fails. There should be a second option, a backup, a place to go when the first shelter proves insufficient. He did not yet know what form this would take, but the need for it lodged in his mind like a splinter he could not remove. His father, noticing the boy's withdrawn silence in the days after Pavel's death, took him aside one evening and taught him the first principles of roof construction. They did not speak directly about what had happened. Instead, his father showed him how to judge the strength of a timber by its grain, how to calculate load-bearing capacity not with numbers, but with the practiced eye of someone who had built many roofs and seen some of them fail. He taught Stepan that wood has memory, that it remembers how it grew, and responds to stress according to patterns laid down when it was still a living tree. These lessons were delivered in the quiet language of craft. and Stepan absorbed them completely. By age 12, he could look at a cabin's roof and tell you where its weaknesses lay. By 15, he was helping to build new cabins for settlers arriving from the West, people fleeing poverty or persecution, or simply seeking land that was abundant and free, even if that freedom came with the price of winter's cruelty. It was during these building projects that Stepan began to meet Evenki hunters who passed through the settlements or camped nearby during their seasonal movements. His mother's fragments of language allowed him to communicate, haltingly at first, then with growing confidence. He watched how they built their temporary shelters, structures that seemed impossibly simple, yet stood against storms that would destroy a poorly built cabin. They showed him the snow shelter they called Igda, carved from packed snow with sleeping platforms raised above the cold floor, ventilation holes angled to prevent drafts while allowing air to circulate. They showed him how to build emergency burrows under fallen trees, how to line them with birch bark to keep moisture from the earth from penetrating your clothing. They showed him how to read snow, not just by looking at it, but by touching it, listening to it, understanding its different layers and textures, and what each layer told you about the weather that had created it. One old Evenki hunter, a man whose name Stepan never learned how to pronounce correctly, taught him the most valuable lesson of all. The earth itself is a shelter, warmer than the air in deep winter, stable in ways that structures built above ground can never be. Underground spaces, properly ventilated, maintain a temperature above freezing even when the air outside drops to 40 below. This knowledge merged with Stepan's earlier conviction that people needed second shelters, backup options. The solution became clear: build hidden places underground, near but separate from the main cabins, places designed specifically for surviving storms that destroyed everything else. He was 17 when he built his first such shelter for his own family. It was crude by the standards he would develop later. Barely large enough for 4 people to huddle together, ventilation insufficient, roof built too heavy for its supports. But it worked. That winter brought another terrible storm, and though their cabin held, Stepan moved his family into the underground shelter as a test, a way to understand what worked and what needed improvement. They spent 18 hours there, and by the time they emerged, Stepan had filled his mind with observations. The air grew stale too quickly, the entrance collected snow and became difficult to open, the floor was too cold despite the straw layering, the space was too dark without sufficient lamp oil. He spent the next summer rebuilding it, applying everything he had learned. The second version was better. The third version, built when he was 19, was good enough that when word spread of what he had done, others began asking him to build similar shelters for their families. He was not yet known as a master craftsman, not yet someone whose opinion carried weight in community decisions. He was simply a young man with an unusual obsession, a peculiar dedication to solving a problem most people preferred not to think about. But practical solutions speak louder than reputation, and his practical solutions worked. At 23, Stepan married a woman named Daria, daughter of a family who had arrived in the settlement only 2 years before. She was not beautiful in the conventional sense. Her face was broad and weathered by wind, her hands calloused from work. But she was competent and calm and unafraid of hardship. She understood immediately why Stepan spent so much time on his hidden shelters. Her family's first winter here had nearly killed them. Their cabin, built hastily with poor materials, had let in cold through every crack and gap. Only the charity of neighbors, sharing fuel and food, had seen them through to spring. She had learned the same lesson Stepan had learned at 9. Survival here was not guaranteed by hope or faith, but by preparation and knowledge. They built their first home together on the edge of the settlement, and before they built the cabin, Stepan built the shelter. This became his practice, first the hidden place, then the visible one. People thought this strange, building backwards, but Stepan had his reasons. The shelter required careful site selection, proper drainage, specific soil conditions. Once it was built, the cabin's position and design could be adjusted to optimize the distance between them, to ensure that a family fleeing a collapsing cabin would have a clear, short path to safety. Daria supported this method without question, even though it meant they spent their first months as a married couple living in a temporary structure, while Stepan excavated earth and laid birch bark and constructed the underground chamber that might save their lives someday. Their first child was born the following year, a daughter they named Elena. 2 more children followed, a son, Mikhail, and another daughter, Irina. Stepan taught them all, from the time they could walk, the location of the shelter and the path to reach it. He made them practice in darkness, in snow, with their eyes closed. Some neighbors thought this excessive, training children so young in survival skills that might never be needed. But Stepan had seen Pavel's frozen body carried past his childhood home, and he would not take chances with his children's lives. In 1775, when Stepan was 28, the storm came that changed everything. It began on a Tuesday in December with the familiar signs, the flat grey sky, the oppressive stillness, the restless behavior of animals. But this storm was different in scale from anything the settlement had experienced before. Later, people would call it the 3-day storm, though in truth it lasted nearly 36 hours. It simply felt longer in memory. The wind reached speeds that tore roofs from cabins like peeling bark from a log. Snow fell so thick and fast that it accumulated in drifts higher than a man's head in the span of hours. The temperature dropped so precipitously that water thrown into the air froze before it hit the ground. Trees snapped like dry kindling, their cracks audible even over the roar of wind. Stepan had moved his family into their shelter hours before the worst of it hit. He had learned to read winter's moods with precision by now, and everything about this storm's approach told him it would be catastrophic. His shelter was well stocked, well ventilated, prepared. They were uncomfortable but safe, huddled together in lamplight, while the world above them raged and howled. But as the storm intensified, Stepan heard something that made his blood cold. Voices outside, shouting, barely audible over the wind. Someone was out there, in the storm, in conditions that meant certain death within minutes. He did not hesitate. He wrapped himself in every layer of fur and leather he owned, tied a rope around his waist, and secured the other end to a timber inside the shelter, and crawled out into the storm. The wind hit him like a wall, nearly knocking him backwards into the shelter entrance. Snow blinded him instantly, stinging his exposed face like driven needles. He could see nothing, hear nothing, beyond the storm's roar, but he followed the rope with one hand and felt his way forward, shouting though he knew his voice would not carry. His feet found shapes in the snow. People, 2 adults and 2 children, collapsed together 20 feet from his shelter entrance. They were his neighbors from 3 cabins away, the Volkov family. Their cabin had collapsed, they had tried to reach someone else's home, had become disoriented in the whiteout. Stepan grabbed the nearest child, dragged the body back toward his shelter, using the rope as a guide. He could not tell if the child was alive or dead. He handed the small bundle down to Daria through the entrance, then hauled himself back along the rope into the storm. He found the Volkovs again by following his own disturbed snow tracks, visible for only moments before the wind erased them. He dragged the second child back, then returned for the father, a large man nearly impossible to move through deep snow. Stepan's muscles screamed, his lungs burned with cold air. His exposed face had gone numb beyond feeling. He made the journey twice more, once for the father, once for the mother, and by the time he pulled the last body into the shelter and collapsed beside them, he was beyond exhaustion, operating on something more primal than will. Daria was already working on the children, rubbing their frozen limbs, stripping away wet clothes and wrapping them in furs. The Volkovs were in terrible condition, blue-lipped, barely conscious, ice forming in their hair and beards. But they were alive. All of them lived through that night, crowded into a shelter designed for 4 people, but now holding 9. There was no room to lie down, barely room to sit. The air grew thick and stale despite the ventilation, and they had to carefully ration lamp oil to make it last through the long hours. The children cried from cold and fear and discomfort, but they cried, which meant they were breathing, which meant Stepan's desperate rescue had not been in vain. When the storm finally broke and they emerged into a transformed landscape, drifts reshaped, trees down, several cabins destroyed or badly damaged, the story of what Stepan had done spread through the settlement within hours. He had saved 4 lives by building a shelter capable of holding more than his own family, and by risking his own life to bring them into it. The Volkov father, once he recovered enough to speak, told everyone who would listen that Stepan had appeared in the storm like a ghost, a rope around his waist, and had dragged them one by one from certain death into the earth's safety. He said it as though describing a miracle, but Stepan knew it was not a miracle. It was preparation and rope and a shelter built large enough to account for the possibility that others might need it. The community's attitude toward hidden shelters changed overnight. Suddenly, everyone wanted one. People who had dismissed the idea as unnecessary, as fearful, as excessive preparation against unlikely disasters, now came to Stepan asking him to design and build underground chambers for their families. He agreed to all requests. He taught himself to work faster without sacrificing quality. He developed standardized designs that could be adapted to different terrain and soil conditions. He created a system for ensuring proper ventilation, using angled tunnels that opened some distance from the main chamber, disguised among rocks or buried logs. He trained other men to help with the excavation and construction, so he could oversee multiple projects simultaneously. Over the next 5 years, Stepan built or directly supervised the building of 43 hidden shelters across the settlement and in 2 neighboring communities. Some were simple, just large enough for a single family. Others were larger, designed to accommodate multiple families if necessary. One particularly ambitious project involved excavating a chamber large enough for 15 people, built into a hillside equidistant from 3 cabins, a shared refuge for families who trusted each other enough to plan for combined survival. Stepan developed a teaching method for those who could not afford to hire him but wanted to build their own shelters. He created wooden boards etched with simple diagrams showing proper dimensions, ventilation angles, roof support patterns. He could not write more than his own name, but he could draw clear, precise illustrations that communicated everything a careful builder needed to know. He distributed these boards freely, asking nothing in return except that people who used his designs would show them to others who needed them. Knowledge, he believed, should not be hoarded when lives depended on its spread. But his work came at a personal cost. The building projects demanded endless hours, much of it in conditions that strained his body past reasonable limits. Winter construction was particularly brutal, excavating frozen earth, working in cold that made tools brittle and dangerous, exposure that left his fingers and toes perpetually numb. At 35, he lost feeling in 2 fingers of his left hand, frost damage that never fully healed. The digits remained partially numb for the rest of his life, clumsy and unreliable, a constant reminder of the price his body paid for his mission. His family suffered from his absences. He was often away for weeks at a time, traveling to distant settlements to build shelters or advise on construction problems. Daria managed their household alone, raising their children and maintaining their own homestead, while Stepan carved safety into hillsides for strangers. She never complained, at least not where others could hear, but Stepan saw the weariness in her face, the lines that deepened around her eyes with each year. Their son Mikhail grew resentful, feeling his father cared more for the community's survival than for his own family's needs. There was truth in this resentment, though Stepan would not have phrased it the same way. He saw no distinction between protecting his family and protecting everyone. Winter threatened all equally, and a community where everyone survived was a community where his own children would have help when they needed it. But explaining this to a 15-year-old boy who wanted his father home for dinner was a conversation Stepan never quite managed successfully. In 1790, a man named Grigory Petrov, newly arrived from a town 300 kilometers west, built a cabin at the settlement's edge and refused to build a hidden shelter. He declared loudly and often that such precautions were the habits of frightened people, that his cabin was built strongly enough to withstand any storm, that going underground was an admission of weakness. Stepan tried to speak with him, offered to help with the construction free of charge, explained calmly and without judgment that storms here did not respect confidence or pride. Grigory laughed at him, called him an old woman, said that people who spent their lives preparing for disasters would never have time to actually live. The settlement watched this confrontation with quiet discomfort. Some sided with Grigory, feeling that perhaps they had all become too cautious, too controlled by fear. Others saw in Grigory's confidence a dangerous ignorance, the arrogance of someone who had not yet been tested by this land's worst offerings. Stepan did not argue further. He had learned that some knowledge could not be taught with words. It had to be earned through experience, and he hoped Grigory's necessary education would come in a mild storm, one that would frighten him but leave him alive and wiser. That winter was unusually calm through December and January. Grigory took this as validation of his position, pointed to the mild weather as proof that everyone's fears were exaggerated. Then February came, and with it a storm that, while not as severe as the legendary 3-day storm, was brutal enough. Grigory's cabin roof collapsed in the night under snow load compounded by wind pressure against a design that looked strong but had fatal weaknesses in its joinery. The family, Grigory, his wife, and their infant daughter, fled into the storm with nothing but the clothes they wore and the blankets they grabbed as the roof came down. Grigory tried to reach the nearest neighbor's cabin, became disoriented in the whiteout, led his family in circles through the snow. They were found the next morning, after the storm passed. The infant was dead, frozen in her mother's arms. Grigory and his wife survived, though both lost toes to frostbite and nearly lost more. Grigory never spoke loudly again about the unnecessary nature of preparations. He left the settlement that spring, unable to bear living in the place where his daughter had died because of his own stubborn refusal to listen. Stepan felt no satisfaction in being proven right. He attended the infant's funeral, stood in the back while the tiny body was buried in earth still partially frozen, and wept silently for a death that could have been prevented by the simple existence of a hole in the ground lined with birch bark. After that tragedy, no one in the settlement ever questioned the value of hidden shelters again. New arrivals were told, as part of their welcome, that they would need to build or commission a secondary shelter before their first winter. It became as fundamental as having a cabin itself, the visible home and the hidden one, two parts of a single survival strategy. Stepan's work began to reach beyond individual shelters. He was consulted on community planning, on where new cabins should be built in relation to terrain features that might offer natural protection or drainage. He advised on the design of communal storage buildings, teaching the same principles of redundancy and backup planning. Never keep all your community's food in one structure, because if that structure burns or collapses, everyone starves. He became, though he held no official title, a kind of elder advisor, someone whose opinion carried weight in discussions about anything related to survival and preparation. The Evenki hunters who passed through the region began to call him the one who listens to winter, a phrase that translated awkwardly but whose meaning was clear. He had learned to hear what the cold and snow and wind were teaching, and he applied those lessons with a consistency that earned their respect. Some of the younger Evenki men sought him out to learn his shelter-building techniques, wanting to combine their traditional methods with his systematic approach. These exchanges went both ways. Stepan learned from them about reading animal behavior, about identifying safe travel routes through territory that looked uniformly treacherous, about the spiritual dimension of survival that his own culture largely ignored. He never fully understood their belief system, but he respected the way it shaped their relationship with the land and weather. In his 50s, Stepan began to slow down. The decades of harsh physical labor caught up with him. His joints stiffened, his back developed a persistent ache that no amount of heat could fully relieve. His breathing grew labored after exertion. He could no longer excavate frozen earth with the stamina of his youth, but his knowledge had not diminished, and he adapted his role accordingly. He became purely an advisor, a designer, a teacher. He would visit a site, study the terrain, mark out with sticks and string exactly where the shelter should be built, and how deep and at what angles the ventilation should run. Then younger men would do the actual digging and building, while Stepan supervised and corrected and explained why each detail mattered. His wooden instruction boards became legendary, passed from settlement to settlement, copied and recopied, distributed across a territory spanning hundreds of kilometers. People who never met Stepan used his designs to build shelters that saved their families' lives. His methods became standardized practice across the entire region, so thoroughly absorbed into common knowledge that within a generation, many people no longer remembered where the techniques had originated. This anonymity did not bother him. He had never been interested in recognition, only in the problem and its solution. In 1810, at 63 years old, Stepan sat in his cabin during a winter storm. Not a catastrophic one, just a typical brutal storm of the kind that came several times each season. His family was grown now, his children living in their own cabins with their own hidden shelters, built according to their father's teachings. Daria sat beside him, older now, her hair white, her hands still steady as she worked at her endless mending. Outside, wind howled and snow fell, and Stepan listened to the familiar sounds of winter's fury. But he listened without fear, without tension, without the constant mental calculation of risk and response that had dominated his earlier years. His cabin was sound. He had built it himself, incorporating every lesson learned from decades of watching structures fail. His hidden shelter waited nearby, maintained and ready, though he had not needed to use it in more than a decade. His neighbors' cabins were equally prepared, equally safe. The community had absorbed his teachings so completely that hidden shelters were now as common as root cellars, simply part of the landscape of survival. He had done what he set out to do after seeing Pavel's body carried past his childhood home. He had created a better way, a backup system that gave people a second chance when their first shelter failed. How many lives had been saved by his work? He had no way to count, but the number was certainly measured in dozens, possibly hundreds, if you included all the people sheltered in structures built using his designs across the wider region. Children had grown to adulthood. Who would have frozen as infants without the hidden places their parents fled to in desperate storms? Families remained intact who would have been shattered by death if not for the backup option that Stepan had made standard practice. This was his legacy, though he did not think of it in such grand terms. He thought of it simply as work done, problem solved, knowledge passed on. The storm raged through the night and into the next day, but Stepan slept peacefully through most of it, his sleep that of someone who has prepared as thoroughly as human effort allows and can therefore rest without anxiety. When the storm finally cleared and he emerged into the sharp cold of the aftermath, he walked through the settlement and checked on neighbors, particularly the elderly and those living alone. Everyone was fine. Every cabin had held. No one had needed to flee to their emergency shelters this time, though everyone had them ready. Stepan felt a quiet satisfaction in this. Not the dramatic satisfaction of a rescue performed or a disaster averted, but the subtler satisfaction of a system working exactly as designed, so reliably that its use became unnecessary. He lived another 8 years, dying in his sleep in the autumn of 1818 at the age of 71. His death was quiet, unremarkable, the natural conclusion of a life fully lived. His funeral was attended by more people than had ever gathered in the settlement for any event. People traveled from distant communities to pay their respects, not because he was famous, but because he had directly or indirectly saved many of their lives. The Evenki hunters who happened to be passing through the region during that time joined the funeral, standing respectfully at the edge of the gathering. One of them spoke briefly, in halting Russian, about how Stepan had been a man who understood what the land was teaching, who listened to winter and learned from it, who shared his knowledge freely. This was perhaps the finest eulogy, coming from people whose culture had survived in this landscape for countless generations, and who recognized in Stepan a kindred approach to survival, observation, adaptation, preparation, and the humble acknowledgement that the land was stronger than any individual, but that intelligence and community could create resilience. Stepan was buried in the settlement's small cemetery, in ground that was just beginning to freeze as winter approached again. His grave was marked with a simple wooden cross, and in time that cross weathered and fell and was replaced, as all wooden markers eventually are. But his hidden shelters remained, dug deep into earth that did not decay, maintained by families who understood their value, passed down through generations along with the knowledge of how to build and maintain them. Long after his name was forgotten by most, his methods persisted, woven so completely into the fabric of survival that they became invisible, assumed as fundamental as the need for fire and shelter. And perhaps this is the truest legacy, not fame, not memorials, but the quiet persistence of practical knowledge, the way a good idea spreads and takes root and becomes simply the way things are done, so obvious that no one remembers it was ever otherwise. Let us drift now from the known into the uncertain, from documented lives into the realm of traces and fragments, where archaeology meets folklore, and the line between practical survival and spiritual practice grows wonderfully blurred. The hidden shelters of the Siberian frontier left marks in the earth that persist long after the people who built them have vanished from memory, and these marks tell stories that are incomplete, suggestive, sometimes contradictory. Modern researchers trudging through forests that have reclaimed former settlements find themselves confronted with questions that have no definitive answers, only possibilities that shift like snow in wind. They walk through birch groves where cabins once stood, where families carved existence from frozen ground, and they search for depressions that might indicate human alteration of the landscape centuries ago. In the summer of 1967, a team of Soviet archaeologists surveying a site near the Lena River discovered something unusual: a series of depressions in the forest floor, roughly circular, each about 3 meters across. At first, They assumed these were natural features, perhaps sinkholes or the remains of uprooted trees. But closer examination revealed something different. These depressions were too regular, too deliberately shaped. The earth had been moved with intention, carved with purpose that transcended the random patterns of natural erosion. The team leader, a middle-aged archaeologist named Dmitry Sokolov, noticed that the depressions were spaced at intervals that suggested human settlement patterns rather than geological accident. When they began excavating one of them, they found walls lined with birch bark, still intact after more than a century underground, preserved by the particular chemistry of the soil and the depth at which they had been placed. They found the remains of wooden roof supports, collapsed now but still recognizable in their pattern and purpose. They found layers of organic material that analysis suggested had once been straw and furs, bedding for human bodies that had long since decayed or been removed. They had discovered a network of hidden shelters, abandoned settlement sites where people had once carved survival into the earth. The discovery sent ripples through Soviet archaeological circles, as researchers had long suspected that frontier settlers must have had emergency refugees beyond their primary dwellings, but evidence had been elusive. The structures were so well integrated into the landscape that decades of Soviet development and forestry had passed over them without recognition. Over the following decades, archaeologists would find dozens more of these sites across the Siberian frontier regions. Each discovery added pieces to a puzzle that remained stubbornly incomplete because the shelters themselves were designed to leave minimal trace, to blend into the landscape, to be hidden even from those actively searching. The people who built them did not leave written records explaining their construction methods or their symbolic meanings. They left only the structures themselves and the objects found within them, and these physical remains speak in a language that requires interpretation, guesswork, informed speculation. This silence is not unusual in the history of frontier settlements, where literacy rates were low and daily survival took precedence over documentation. The few written accounts that mention underground refugees do so in passing, as brief notes in letters or official reports, offering tantalizing glimpses but little detail. One of the most intriguing aspects of these archaeological findings is the variation in shelter design. While some conform to what we might expect from Stepan's documented methods, practical chambers with clear ventilation systems and straightforward layouts, others are far stranger. Some shelters are too small to have been practical for family groups, barely large enough for a single person to lie down. Were these emergency refugees for individuals caught in sudden storms? Were they meditation chambers? Were they places where people went to be alone with their thoughts, in a culture where privacy was nearly impossible, in the crowded conditions of frontier cabins? The shelters offer no answers, only their own mute presence. Some shelters have multiple chambers connected by tunnels, elaborate underground networks that seem far more complex than necessary for simple storm survival. One site near the Aldan River revealed a three-chamber system with tunnels connecting each chamber, the whole complex carved into a hillside with ventilation shafts emerging at different elevations. The labor required to build such a structure would have been immense, the planning sophisticated. What purpose could justify such effort? Researchers have proposed various theories. These might have been communal shelters for larger groups or staged refugees where people could retreat from outer chambers to inner ones if the outer chambers were compromised. Or perhaps these were built over many years by successive generations, each adding to what came before. But these are only theories. The earth keeps its secrets well. The multi-chamber shelters present particular puzzles because their complexity suggests either extended periods of construction or coordinated community effort that seems at odds with the isolated nature of frontier existence. Some chambers appear to have been abandoned mid-construction, their walls partially lined, their ventilation shafts incomplete, as if the builders were called away suddenly or decided the effort was not worth continuing. Among the most puzzling discoveries are what archaeologists have termed breathing stones, small rocks, usually smooth river stones, embedded in the walls of some shelters at regular intervals. These stones are set into the birch bark, lining in a way that suggests deliberate placement, not random or structural necessity. They form patterns, sometimes in circles, sometimes in lines, sometimes in arrangements that seem to follow no obvious logic. Early researchers assumed these were structural elements, perhaps helping to stabilize the earth walls or manage moisture. But the stones themselves are not structurally significant. They are too small, too regularly spaced, set too shallowly into the walls to serve any obvious practical function. Chemical analysis revealed nothing unusual about the stones themselves. They are ordinary river stones, granite and quartz, worn smooth by water. But their placement was clearly intentional, clearly meaningful to the people who set them there. One theory suggests they were related to ventilation, that somehow the stones helped air circulate through the walls, though the mechanism for how this would work remains unexplained. The name breathing stones comes from Evenki informants interviewed in the 1970s, who told researchers that their ancestors believed stones could help a shelter breathe, could keep the air fresh and the space alive. But when pressed for details about how this worked, the informants could only shrug and say that this was old knowledge passed down in fragments, the specifics lost. The researchers conducting these interviews noted a pattern. Older informants seemed to have more confidence in the efficacy of breathing stones even while knowing less about the mechanism, while younger informants were skeptical but could recall more detailed descriptions passed down from their grandparents. This generational divide in knowledge and belief is characteristic of traditional practices encountering modernity's demand for empirical explanation. Another theory proposes that the stones were symbolic rather than functional, markers of protection or blessings, perhaps related to animist beliefs about the spirits inhabiting rocks and earth. In many indigenous Siberian cultures, stones are seen as having their own kind of life, their own slow consciousness. Placing them in shelter walls might have been a way of inviting their protection, of asking the earth itself to help guard the people taking refuge within it. This interpretation is supported by the fact that some stones bear faint scratches that might be deliberative markings, though they could equally well be natural wear patterns. The ambiguity is frustrating for researchers seeking definitive answers, but it is also part of the shelter's mystery, their resistance to being fully understood. We can document what was done, but we cannot always recover why. Some researchers have attempted to test the breathing stone hypothesis experimentally, building replica shelters with and without stones to measure differences in air quality and circulation. The results have been inconclusive, showing minor variations that might or might not be significant, that could be attributed to stones or to countless other variables in shelter construction and environment. The practice of building hidden shelters existed at the intersection of multiple cultural traditions, and untangling which influences came from where is perhaps impossible at this distance. Russian settlers brought with them knowledge of root cellars and underground storage, traditions of digging into earth to preserve food and create cool spaces in summer. But the hidden storm shelters of the Siberian frontier were different from European root cellars in significant ways. Their emphasis on ventilation, their integration with natural terrain, their spiritual as well as practical dimensions. These differences suggest heavy influence from indigenous Evenki and Yakut building traditions, peoples who had lived in this landscape for countless generations and had developed survival strategies perfectly adapted to its demands. The Evenki, nomadic hunters who followed reindeer herds across vast territories, built temporary shelters from whatever materials were available: snow, branches, earth, bark. Their knowledge was pragmatic and flexible, based on reading the landscape and adapting to its offerings rather than imposing predetermined designs. They taught Russian settlers to see the forest not as a resource to be conquered, but as a teacher to be studied. They showed them how snow itself could become shelter material, how wind patterns could be predicted by observing tree shapes, how certain slopes held less snow than others and were therefore safer for building. This knowledge transfer was rarely formalized or documented. It happened through observation, through working alongside indigenous guides, through the gradual osmosis of practical wisdom that occurs when peoples live in proximity and share a common challenge of survival. The process was not always friendly or equal. Russian colonization brought displacement and hardship to indigenous populations, but at the practical level of staying alive in brutal conditions, knowledge flowed across cultural boundaries because survival has no ideology. A technique that kept you from freezing to death was valuable regardless of who first developed it. The Yakut, who had a more settled lifestyle than the Evenki, built permanent structures that incorporated underground elements, semi-subterranean dwellings called balagan that used earth insulation to maintain stable temperatures year-round. Their building techniques influenced Russian settler construction in subtle ways. The use of birch bark as a moisture barrier, the careful attention to ventilation, the understanding that underground spaces could be warmer than surface structures in winter. But they also brought spiritual practices related to underground spaces, beliefs about the earth as a living entity that could offer protection if approached with proper respect. Russian Orthodox settlers did not adopt these beliefs wholesale, but neither did they entirely reject them. The result was a kind of folk syncretism, where Christian prayers might be said while placing stones in shelter walls according to patterns taught by Evenki neighbors, where the practical and the spiritual merged in ways that neither culture would have practiced in isolation. This blending was not always conscious or deliberate. It emerged organically from the pressures of frontier life, where survival demanded borrowing whatever worked from whoever knew it. Orthodox priests serving frontier communities sometimes struggled with these hybrid practices, uncertain whether to condemn them as pagan superstition or accept them as harmless folk customs. Most chose a middle path, focusing their spiritual guidance on major religious observances while overlooking the small rituals people performed in their daily lives, the prayers to Christian saints mixed with gestures learned from indigenous neighbors. One of the strangest findings in hidden shelter archaeology is the presence of small carved objects, usually made from wood or bone, found in the corners or buried beneath the floors of some shelters. These objects are often abstract, simple geometric patterns, spirals, or shapes that don't clearly represent anything recognizable. Some researchers interpret them as good luck charms, talismans meant to protect the occupants. Others see them as markers, ways of identifying who built the shelter or which family it belonged to. Still others suggest they might be offerings, gifts to the earth in exchange for the space carved from it, a gesture of reciprocity with the land itself. One particularly elaborate carving found in a shelter near the Vilyui River depicts what might be a storm, swirling lines radiating from a central point, or might be something entirely different, perhaps a representation of wind or water, or some concept that does not translate easily into visual form. The carving is beautiful in its simplicity, worked with obvious care by someone who had both skill and time. It was found beneath the floorboards, carefully wrapped in birch bark, placed in a position where it would never be seen once the shelter was complete. Why create something beautiful and then hide it, when no one could appreciate it? Was the act of creating it the point, rather than the object itself? Was it meant to be seen by spirits or forces rather than human eyes? Or was it simply placed there as a kind of foundational blessing, a good wish embedded in the structure itself? We cannot know. The carver left no explanation, and the shelter itself offers no clues beyond the object's presence. Similar practices appear in other cultural contexts: foundation deposits, objects buried beneath buildings as offerings or protective measures. But the specific meanings varied widely from culture to culture. Without written records or continuous oral tradition connecting these Siberian carvings to known practices, we are left with analogies and possibilities rather than certainties. The spiritual dimension of hidden shelters becomes even more complex when we consider the symbolism of going underground. In many cultures worldwide, entering the earth is associated with death, burial, returning to the womb of the world. But it is also associated with rebirth, transformation, emergence into new life. Caves feature prominently in shamanic traditions across Siberia as places of vision quests and spiritual transformation. Going underground was not simply a practical act, but a symbolically loaded one, carrying meanings that would have been intuitively understood by people immersed in these cultural traditions. When a family retreated into their hidden shelter during a storm, they were not merely seeking physical protection, they were enacting a kind of ritual return to the earth, a temporary death, and waiting for rebirth that would come when they emerged into the calm air of the storm's aftermath. This interpretation is supported by recorded oral traditions among both Russian settlers and indigenous peoples. Stories speak of storms as cleansing events, as times when the world was remade, when the old was swept away to make room for the new. Surviving a storm meant you had been tested and found worthy to continue. The hidden shelter was not just a survival tool, but a liminal space, a threshold between the world as it was and the world as it would become. Whether the people who built and used these shelters consciously thought in these terms is impossible to determine. Symbolism and practicality were probably inseparable in their minds, two aspects of the same reality rather than distinct categories. Modern researchers sometimes struggle with this integration, trained to separate the functional from the symbolic, the material from the spiritual. But frontier life demanded a holistic approach to existence, where all aspects of experience were interconnected, where building a shelter involved both engineering calculations and spiritual preparations. Some archaeological sites reveal evidence of what appear to be ritual practices associated with shelters. At one site in the Kolyma region, researchers found the remains of a small fire pit just inside a shelter entrance, in a location that made no practical sense. The fire would have consumed precious oxygen in an already confined space, and its heat would have been minimal. Analysis of the soil around the pit revealed traces of specific plants known to produce aromatic smoke when burned, plants that had no nutritional or medicinal value but were used in purification rituals by local indigenous groups. Was this fire lit as part of a cleansing ritual before entering the shelter? Was it a way of blessing the space, of transforming it from mere hole in the ground into sacred refuge? Or are we reading too much into what might have been a simple mistake, a poorly thought-out attempt to stay warm? The evidence allows multiple interpretations, and perhaps that multiplicity is itself significant, a reminder that the people who built these shelters were as complex and contradictory as people always are, blending the practical and the spiritual in ways that made sense to them but that we can only partially reconstruct. The fire pit at this particular site also contained charred remains of what appeared to be birch bark strips, which might have been used as kindling or might have been deliberately burned for their symbolic significance. Birch was considered sacred in many Siberian traditions. Another layer of mystery surrounds the maintenance and transmission of shelter knowledge. How did information about construction techniques spread across such vast territories? The Siberian frontier in the 18th and 19th centuries was not a connected place. Settlements were separated by enormous distances. Communication was slow and difficult. Travel was dangerous, especially in winter. Yet similar shelter designs appear across regions separated by hundreds of kilometers, suggesting some kind of information network that we can only glimpse through its effects. Stepan's wooden instruction boards provide part of the answer, but they cannot be the whole explanation. The boards would have been difficult to transport over long distances, and their effectiveness depended on people being literate enough to understand diagrams, which many frontier settlers were not. More likely, knowledge spread through traveling craftsmen, through seasonal workers who moved from settlement to settlement, through traders and hunters and Orthodox priests making their rounds. Each person carried fragments of knowledge, techniques learned in one place and applied in another, adapted to local conditions and materials. Over time, these fragments crystallized into regional variations, different approaches to the same basic problem, each shaped by the specific challenges and resources of its location. Some areas favored shallow, wide shelters built into hillsides. Others preferred deeper, vertical shafts with ladder access. Some used primarily wooden construction, while others incorporated more stone and earth. These variations were not random but reflected careful observation of local geology, drainage patterns, soil types, typical storm behaviors. The knowledge was empirical, tested through trial and error, refined through generations of use. When shelters failed, and some inevitably did, people analyzed what went wrong and adjusted their methods accordingly. This is science in its most fundamental form: hypothesis, testing, refinement. Though the people involved would never have used such terms, they would have simply called it learning from experience, paying attention, not making the same mistake twice. The archaeological record shows evidence of this learning process in the form of rebuilt shelters, structures that were modified or relocated after initial construction, improvements made based on practical experience. One site shows 3 generations of shelter construction in the same location, each built slightly differently, each incorporating lessons learned from the previous version's shortcomings. The first shelter had inadequate ventilation and was rebuilt with better airflow. The second had drainage problems and was rebuilt on slightly higher ground with channels cut to divert water. The third incorporated both improvements and lasted for decades before being finally abandoned when the settlement itself was abandoned. This is not dramatic history, but it is perhaps more fundamentally human than the history of great events and famous names. It is the history of people paying attention, making adjustments, slowly getting better at staying alive. Each improvement represented someone's observation, someone's insight into why the previous design had failed, someone's willingness to invest labor in making the next version better, even though they might not personally benefit from the improvement. There are mysteries that archaeology will probably never resolve, gaps in the record that cannot be filled with the evidence available. We do not know, for instance, how many people actually died in hidden shelters, whether some of these refugees became tombs for families who retreated into them and never emerged, perhaps because the entrance became blocked by snow, or because they ran out of fuel and froze, or because the ventilation failed and they suffocated. The shelters themselves would not necessarily preserve evidence of such deaths, especially if bodies were later removed for proper burial once the storm passed. But the possibility haunts the archaeological sites, the knowledge that some of these spaces witnessed not triumph over winter but winter's final victory. We do not know how decisions were made about when to retreat into shelters, whether families sometimes waited too long, gambling that their cabins would hold when they should have fled earlier. We do not know if there were conflicts over shared shelters, disputes about who had the right to take refuge in structures built by or for specific families. We do not know if some people refused to build shelters out of pride or fatalism or simple exhaustion, and what happened to them when storms came. The written record from this period is sparse and focused on official matters, tax collection, criminal cases, occasional disaster reports. Ordinary daily life, the small decisions and struggles that filled most people's days, went largely unrecorded. The archaeological record fills some gaps but creates others, showing us what was done but not always why, revealing the fact of practices but not the thoughts and feelings of the practitioners. The few personal letters that survive from frontier settlers rarely mention shelters explicitly, perhaps because such structures were so commonplace that they needed no explanation, or perhaps because letter writers focused on more dramatic or unusual events worth documenting. One letter from 1843, written by a settler woman to her sister in European Russia, mentions going down below during a storm but provides no details about what that meant or how the underground refuge was constructed. In recent decades, some researchers have attempted to find living memory of hidden shelter practices by interviewing descendants of frontier settlers, elderly people who grew up hearing stories from grandparents who might have actually used the shelters. These oral histories are valuable but also problematic. Memory is unreliable, stories change in retelling, details become confused or embellished. One elderly woman interviewed in the 1990s described her grandmother's stories of sheltering underground during storms, but she also described elements that seemed clearly fantastical: shelters that were warm without fire, ventilation shafts that somehow brought in fresh air without bringing in cold, spaces that were larger inside than seemed possible from their external dimensions. Are these embellishments added over decades of retelling? Are they metaphorical descriptions of psychological experiences, the shelter feeling warmer than it was because it meant safety, feeling larger because it held the whole family? Or do they reflect practices and techniques that were real but that we no longer understand, knowledge that has been lost? The ambiguity is maddening for researchers, but also strangely appropriate for spaces that were designed to be hidden, built to exist at the margins of visibility and documentation. Perhaps some mysteries are meant to remain mysteries. Perhaps not everything needs to be explained and categorized and reduced to certainty. The hidden shelters served their purpose. They saved lives. They gave people a fighting chance against winter's worst offerings. Whether they also served spiritual purposes, whether they were sites of ritual as well as survival, whether they carried symbolic meanings beyond their practical function, these questions add richness to our understanding, but do not change the fundamental fact of their effectiveness. People survived because of them, because that is the core truth that all the mystery and ambiguity cannot obscure. The shelters worked, and that simple fact matters more than any speculation about their deeper meanings or cultural significance. In some places, in forests that have reclaimed old settlement sites, the hidden shelters still exist. Their roofs have collapsed, their birch bark linings have mostly rotted away, but the depressions remain, gentle dips in the forest floor that you might walk over without noticing if you did not know to look for them. Sometimes hikers stumble across them, these ghost shelters, and peer down into the dim spaces beneath half-collapsed roof timbers, trying to imagine what it was like to huddle there while a storm raged above. Some sites have been preserved and marked, turned into minor historical attractions with interpretive signs explaining their purpose and history. But most remain unmarked, known only to researchers and locals, slowly being absorbed back into the earth that they were carved from. In another century, even the depressions will likely be gone, filled in by natural processes, leaving no trace that people once scraped survival from frozen ground in these particular spots. This erasure is perhaps fitting. The shelters were never meant to be monuments or memorials. They were meant to be used and maintained and, when no longer needed, allowed to fade away. Their builders were practical people who would have found it strange that future generations would study their storm refuges with such scholarly intensity, writing papers and conducting analyses and speculating about symbolic meanings. The shelters were simply what you built if you wanted to survive. That we find them mysterious says more about the distance between our world and theirs than about any intrinsic mysteriousness of the structures themselves. We live in a time and place where survival is mostly assured, where shelter is a given rather than a daily negotiation with hostile forces. We have the luxury of finding mystery in what was, for the builders, simply necessary. But perhaps there is value in that mystery anyway, in allowing ourselves to be puzzled by the past, to acknowledge how much we do not and cannot know. The hidden shelters remind us that history is not only the story of what happened, but also the story of what we can no longer fully recover, the silence where knowledge used to be. They teach us humility in the face of the past, respect for the practical wisdom of people who left few records but built structures that still echo with their care and foresight. They invite us to imagine lives lived at the edge of survival, where a hole in the ground lined with birch bark might mean the difference between life and death, where preparation was not paranoia but prudence, where winter was not a season to enjoy but a force to be endured with whatever tools and knowledge you could gather. And in that imagination we come a little closer to understanding what it meant to live in those times, in that place, under those conditions. Not fully, not completely, but enough to feel a connection across the gulf of years, enough to recognize the essential humanity of people facing challenges we can barely comprehend, with resourcefulness and determination that still echoes in the earth where they dug their survival, season after season, storm after storm, year after frozen year. The study of these shelters continues, with new sites discovered occasionally when construction projects or natural erosion reveals structures that have remained hidden for more than a century. Each discovery adds incrementally to our knowledge while simultaneously revealing how much remains unknown, how many questions we cannot answer with certainty. Modern archaeologists approach these sites with increasingly sophisticated tools, ground-penetrating radar to locate undiscovered shelters, chemical analysis to understand the materials used and their sources, digital modeling to reconstruct how the structures would have functioned when intact. Yet, for all this technological advancement, the fundamental mysteries remain. What it felt like to shelter underground during a 3-day storm, whether people sang or prayed or simply endured in silence. What conversations happened in those dark spaces, what fears and hopes animated the hearts beating in those temporary tombs that doubled as wombs of survival. The shelters exist now in a strange liminal state, neither fully present nor entirely absent, their physical traces persisting while their human meanings fade into speculation and scholarly debate. They are monuments to resourcefulness built by people who would never have thought of themselves as monument builders, who were simply doing what needed to be done with whatever materials and knowledge they had available. In this sense, the hidden shelters are perhaps the most honest kind of historical artifact, unintentional records of ordinary competence, evidence of human adaptability, preserved not because anyone thought it worth preserving, but because the earth itself chose to remember. The depressions in the forest floor speak more eloquently than any written account of what frontier life demanded and what frontier people gave in response. They tell a story of cold and darkness, and the human refusal to surrender to either, of families huddled together in spaces barely larger than graves, waiting for storms to pass and betting their lives that the ventilation would hold and the roof would not collapse, and the entrance would not become irretrievably blocked by drifting snow. Some of those bets were won and some were lost, and both outcomes are written into the soil if we know how to read it. The archaeological work itself has become part of the story, researchers spending summers excavating sites in landscapes where winters can still kill the unprepared, where the same winds that drove people underground 2 centuries ago still howl through the valleys with undiminished force. They work carefully, documenting every layer, every artifact, trying to extract maximum information from remains that were never meant to last, that were built with the understanding that everything eventually returns to Earth. There is something poignant about this effort, this attempt to recover meaning from structures whose builders accepted impermanence as a condition of existence. The researchers are engaged in a kind of conversation across time with people who cannot answer back, asking questions that may have no answers, seeking understanding that may be permanently beyond reach. Yet the work continues because it must, because every fragment of knowledge about how people survived impossible conditions is potentially valuable, because the past deserves to be remembered even when remembering is difficult and uncertain. The hidden shelters of the Siberian frontier will continue to yield their secrets slowly, incompletely, never quite revealing everything we want to know, but offering enough to keep us searching, wondering, trying to bridge the gap between their world and ours through careful study and imaginative reconstruction. In the end, perhaps the most important thing these shelters teach us is that survival is both simpler and more complex than we might imagine. Simpler in that it comes down to basic human needs met through practical means. More complex in that those practical means carried cultural meanings, spiritual significance, social implications that we can barely glimpse across the distance of decades and cultural change. The breathing stones in the walls, the carved objects beneath the floors, the fire pits in impractical locations, all of these remind us that even in extremis, even when focused on the immediate necessity of staying alive, people created meaning, enacted rituals, maintained connections to worldviews that transcended mere physical survival. This is fundamentally what it means to be human, to never be satisfied with mere existence, to always be adding layers of meaning and significance to even the most practical activities. The hidden shelters were holes in the ground lined with bark and insulated with straw, but they were also something more: sanctuaries, temples, testing grounds, wombs, tombs, thresholds between states of being. They were all of these things simultaneously, or they were none of them, or they were whatever their builders and users needed them to be in specific moments of crisis and endurance. We cannot recover the subjective experience of sheltering underground during a Siberian storm, cannot know what thoughts pass through the minds of people crouched in darkness, listening to wind tear at the world above them, cannot fully understand the relief and gratitude of emergence into calm air after days of confinement. But we can study the structures they left behind, can document the patterns and variations, can note the care taken in construction and the thought given to details that made the difference between shelters that worked and shelters that failed. We can recognize in these abandoned refuges evidence of human intelligence applied to survival challenges, of communities sharing knowledge and individuals learning from experience, of a whole culture of preparedness that emerged in response to environmental demands that allowed no margin for error. The hidden shelters are, in their quiet way, as impressive as any cathedral or palace, monuments to human determination, built not to glorify builders or assert power over others, but simply to provide a chance at survival when conditions turned deadly. That they have largely been forgotten, that most people today have never heard of them, and those who have rarely appreciate their significance, seems somehow appropriate. They were never built for recognition or remembrance, but for use, and they served that purpose well for the generations that needed them. Now they serve a different purpose, teaching researchers and through them the broader public about aspects of historical experience that rarely make it into standard narratives, offering material evidence of lives lived at the margins of what human endurance makes possible. The story of the hidden shelters is still being written, still being excavated layer by layer from earth and silence, and it will probably never be complete. But that incompleteness is itself instructive, a reminder that history is not a finished product, but an ongoing process of discovery and interpretation, that the past contains more than we can ever fully know, but rewards every effort to understand it better. The people who built and used these shelters have been dead for generations, their names mostly forgotten, their individual stories lost to time. But something of them persists in the depressions in the forest floor, in the breathing stones still embedded in ancient walls, in the patterns of construction that reveal careful thought and hard-won knowledge. They speak to us across the years in a language we must work to understand, telling us things we need to know about resilience and adaptation, about the human capacity to face impossible conditions and find ways to endure. And in listening to that language, in trying to understand what these silent structures are telling us, we honor the memory of people who deserve to be remembered, not for any great deeds or historical significance, but simply for surviving, for doing what needed to be done with grace and competence, and an attention to detail that still resonates in the earth they shaped to their needs. The hidden shelters of the Siberian frontier are fading slowly back into the landscape from which they were carved, but while they last, they offer us a glimpse into a world where winter was not merely inconvenient, but potentially deadly, where survival was never guaranteed and always required effort and planning and a kind of practical wisdom that we, in our comfortable modern existence, can barely comprehend. They remind us that human history encompasses more than wars and politics and famous individuals, that it includes countless ordinary people doing extraordinary things simply to stay alive, building refuges we would never know about except for the accident of archaeological discovery and the patient work of researchers willing to spend careers studying depressions in forest floors. This too is history worth preserving, worth studying, worth trying to understand, even when understanding comes slowly and incompletely. The hidden shelters have earned their place in the historical record not through grandeur or fame, but through the simple fact of their existence, evidence that when faced with a hostile environment, people found ways to adapt and endure. That lesson resonates across time and remains relevant today, a testament to human resilience that needs no embellishment or exaggeration to be impressive. The holes in the ground, lined with birch bark, the breathing stones placed in walls with care, whose purpose we can no longer fully explain, the carved objects hidden beneath floors where no one would see them. All of these are monuments to people who faced winter's worst and found ways to survive it, who built shelters that worked, even if we cannot fully understand how or why, who left marks in the earth that persist long after their names and stories have been forgotten. In the end, that persistence is its own kind of victory, a quiet triumph over time and forgetting, a reminder that even the most humble structures built by the most ordinary people can contain mysteries worth pondering and lessons worth learning if we are willing to look closely and think carefully about what we see. Let us now turn our attention to a different kind of shelter, a different approach to surviving the Siberian winter's fury. Not all who lived on the frontier faced the same choices or the same constraints, and understanding the hidden shelters fully requires understanding what they were an alternative to, what they represented for those who built them, and what they meant in contrast to the lives of those who did not need them. The frontier was not a place of perfect equality, though distance and isolation flattened some of the hierarchies that structured life in Western Russia. There were still gradations of wealth and status, still families who commanded more resources and wielded more influence than their neighbors. These were the merchants who controlled trade routes, the administrators who represented distant imperial authority, the rare landowners who had been granted territories by the crown, the Orthodox priests who served scattered parishes, the military officers stationed at remote outposts. Their winters were different, not in kind but in degree, shaped by advantages that ordinary settlers could not access. Consider a merchant family living in one of the larger settlements, a place that might have 50 or 60 cabins clustered near a river crossing, or a strategic supply point. Their home was not a simple log cabin but a more substantial structure, built with careful attention to details that required either wealth or connections to obtain. The foundation was stone rather than simply packed earth, quarried and hauled from distant sites at considerable expense. Stone foundations meant the building sat higher off the ground, less vulnerable to moisture and rot, more stable over decades of freeze-thaw cycles. The walls were still logs, as all structures here were logs, but they were carefully selected, old-growth timber, dense and straight, properly seasoned before construction. The gaps between logs were chinked not just with moss and clay, but with oakum and tar, materials that had to be imported from hundreds of kilometers away. The roof was reinforced with additional support beams overbuilt by the standards of ordinary cabins, capable of bearing snow loads that would crush a more modestly constructed dwelling. The pitch was steeper, designed to shed snow more readily, though this meant more complex carpentry and greater use of precious materials. The windows were glass, multiple small panes set in wooden frames, an extravagance that most settlers could never afford. Glass had to be transported vast distances, packed carefully to prevent breakage, traded for at prices that reflected its rarity and fragility. But glass windows meant more light during the brief daylight hours of winter, meant the ability to see outside without opening a door or shutter and letting cold flood in. They meant a psychological comfort that oil paper or stretched hide could not provide, a transparent barrier between inside and outside rather than a blind wall. The very presence of glass transformed the experience of winter confinement in ways that went beyond mere illumination. When you could watch the world outside, even as storms raged, you maintained a connection to the landscape that helped orient your sense of time and space, prevented the disorientation that came with living in what felt like a sealed box for months on end. Inside, the merchant's home had amenities that marked it as belonging to a different class of comfort. Multiple rooms, separated by walls rather than simply divided by curtains, meant privacy and specialized spaces, a room for sleeping, a room for receiving visitors, a room for storage. The stove was built of brick rather than simply stone, constructed by a craftsman who understood thermal dynamics and airflow, capable of burning fuel more efficiently and distributing heat more evenly. Brick had to be made or imported, another expense beyond the reach of ordinary settlers. These brick stoves represented accumulated knowledge from centuries of Russian winter experience, designs refined across generations to extract maximum warmth from minimum fuel. A well-built brick stove could retain heat for hours after the fire died, radiating warmth through the night, whereas stone stoves cooled quickly and demanded constant feeding. The family owned more warm clothing, furs traded from indigenous hunters or purchased from traveling merchants, felt boots and wool blankets, and leather gloves lined with rabbit fur. They had stores of food that went beyond the basics of dried fish and hard bread, preserved meats, dried fruits, honey, tea, salt, in quantities that allowed for proper seasoning rather than mere preservation. They had candles made from beeswax rather than tallow, which burned cleaner and smelled better. They had lamp oil in abundance, could afford to keep lights burning through the long darkness without anxiety about running out before spring. The difference between beeswax and tallow candles might seem trivial to those who have never endured months of winter darkness, but it mattered profoundly to those who lived through it. Tallow candles produced thick, acrid smoke that accumulated in sealed winter cabins, coating surfaces with greasy residue and irritating lungs already challenged by dry indoor air, while beeswax burned with a honey-sweet scent that made close quarters more bearable. These advantages accumulated and compounded. When you are warm enough, you sleep better, which means your body can fight off illness more effectively. When you have adequate nutrition, you maintain strength through the winter rather than slowly weakening as reserves deplete. When you have light to read by and books to read, another luxury, the darkness becomes less oppressive, less psychologically taxing. The ability to read during winter confinement meant access to worlds beyond the frozen frontier, meant intellectual engagement that kept minds active when physical activity was limited. A wealthy merchant might own a dozen books, might have access to newspapers that arrived in bundles with spring's first caravans, carrying news of events that had occurred months earlier but which still connected the frontier to the broader currents of Russian life. When your home is truly weather-tight, you spend less energy simply staying warm, less effort constantly tending fire and repairing gaps where wind infiltrates. The wealthy did not have an easy winter, but they had a more survivable one, a winter that was uncomfortable rather than genuinely life-threatening under normal circumstances. But here is the interesting thing. These wealthy families, with their stone foundations and glass windows and imported tar, generally did not build hidden shelters. This was not because they were unaware of the practice. Everyone on the frontier knew about hidden shelters. They were too common to be ignorant of. Rather, it was a matter of confidence and class perception. The wealthy had invested enormous resources in making their homes as stormproof as possible, and they trusted that investment. Their roofs were stronger, their walls more secure, their supplies more abundant. Building a hidden shelter implied that these advantages might not be enough, and that implication was uncomfortable, perhaps even insulting, to their sense of status. The psychology of this resistance ran deep, touching on fundamental questions about what wealth meant and what it could accomplish. If your superior resources could not guarantee your safety, then what was the point of having accumulated those resources in the first place? And what did it say about your judgment that you had placed such faith in material advantages that might prove insufficient when truly tested? To dig a hole in the ground and prepare to shelter there like a common settler suggested a failure of their superior preparations. It suggested vulnerability they preferred not to acknowledge. There was also a social dimension to this choice. Hidden shelters were associated with poverty, with people who could not afford to build cabins strong enough to withstand the worst storms. They were practical solutions for those who lacked better options, and the wealthy prided themselves on having better options. To build a hidden shelter would have been to admit a kinship with ordinary settlers that their social position was meant to transcend. This was rarely stated explicitly. The frontier was not a place of rigid class structures or openly declared hierarchies, but it was understood nonetheless, an unspoken agreement about what different levels of wealth and status implied about how one prepared for winter. The subtlety of these class distinctions made them no less powerful for being unspoken, and in some ways the implicit nature of the boundaries made them more difficult to cross. An explicit rule could be challenged or debated, but an unspoken assumption about what people of different stations did or did not do simply existed as social reality, enforced by nothing more than shared expectations and the discomfort of violating them. The Orthodox priest in a settlement might visit parishioners' hidden shelters and bless them without judgment, but he would not build one for himself. The merchant would help finance communal preparations without suggesting he needed such preparations personally. The administrator would ensure that settlers under his nominal authority had adequate shelter, without implying that authority figures faced the same vulnerabilities. This confidence was sometimes justified. Many wealthy homes did survive storms that destroyed poorer cabins, their superior construction proving its worth. But not always, and the exceptions were instructive. In 1803, a particularly wealthy merchant named Ivan Dmitrievich, who had made his fortune in the fur trade and lived in a home that was the finest for 300 kilometers in any direction, refused to even discuss the possibility of building a hidden shelter when the topic came up during a community meeting. His home, he said, had been built by the best craftsmen available, using the finest materials money could buy. It had survived a dozen winters without significant damage. He saw no reason to doubt it would continue to survive, and he would not insult the craftsman's work by implying it might fail. Ivan's confidence was rooted in experience that seemed to validate his assumptions. 12 winters without serious incident suggested that his investment in superior construction had been wise. But experience is a treacherous teacher on the frontier because the worst events are rare enough that their absence can be mistaken for impossibility, and what has not happened yet is not the same as what cannot happen at all. His neighbors did not argue with him. He was too important, too wealthy, too accustomed to having his opinions respected. But they exchanged glances that communicated volumes. Pride, they knew, was a dangerous thing in winter. That winter brought a storm that tested everyone's preparations. It was not the worst storm in memory, but it was severe enough. 3 days of sustained wind and heavy snow, temperatures dropping low enough that exposed skin would freeze in minutes. Even Dmitrievich's house withstood the wind. Its walls did not shear, its windows did not burst. But the roof, magnificent as it was, faced a problem that superior materials could not solve. The storm dropped snow faster than the steep pitch could shed it, and the accumulation reached a critical mass in the night of the second day. The particular combination of conditions proved more challenging than the roof's design had anticipated. Wet, heavy snow that accumulated in layers, each layer compressing those beneath it, creating a mass that grew heavier by the hour. The steep pitch that was meant to shed snow worked well for dry, powdery snow that could slide easily. But this wet snow clung and built upon itself, and no amount of quality materials could change the physics of the situation. The roof did not collapse catastrophically, did not cave in all at once. Instead, one of the main support beams cracked, a sound like a gunshot in the darkness, and the roof sagged inward on one side. Snow began to pour through the gap, not in a flood, but steadily, inevitably, and the family realized they had perhaps an hour before the entire structure might come down. They had nowhere to go. The realization must have been terrible, to understand in that moment that all the careful preparation, all the expense, all the confidence had led to this point where they faced the same desperate vulnerability as the poorest settler, but without the poor settler's refuge. The finest house for 300 kilometers offered no more protection than the crudest cabin once its structural integrity was compromised, and wealth counted for nothing against the cold wind now entering through the broken roof. Their nearest neighbor with a hidden shelter was 3 cabins away, across open ground in a blizzard that reduced visibility to arm's length. Ivan made the decision to try anyway, gathered his family, his wife, 2 daughters, a son, and they fled into the storm. They made it, barely, arriving at their neighbor's door half frozen and desperate. The neighbor, a man of modest means, who Ivan had always treated with polite condescension, opened his cabin without hesitation and led them to his hidden shelter. The neighbor's response in that moment revealed something essential about frontier character, that survival knowledge created a kind of obligation that transcended social position, that when someone needed shelter, you provided it regardless of how they had treated you in easier times. There was no mention of past condescensions, no reminder of who had looked down on whom, just the simple human decency of opening a door to those who would die without it. It was cramped with the additional people, uncomfortable, nothing like the spacious rooms of Ivan's fine house. But it was warm and dry and safe, and Ivan's family survived the night there, while his roof completed its collapse under snow that continued falling until dawn. When the storm passed and they emerged, Ivan's house was badly damaged, would require extensive repairs before it was livable again. The irony was not lost on anyone, though people were too kind to mention it directly. The kindness of that silence was itself a form of frontier wisdom, an understanding that humiliation served no purpose, and that Ivan's experience was lesson enough without public commentary. Everyone on the frontier understood that they might someday face a similar moment of reversal, that circumstances could always conspire to humble even the most careful preparation, and there was no satisfaction in pointing out what was already painfully obvious. Ivan himself, humbled by the experience, hired builders that spring to construct a proper hidden shelter for his family. He never spoke publicly about his earlier confidence, but his shelter was built to the highest standards, spacious and well ventilated, stocked with supplies that reflected his wealth. Fine furs instead of rough blankets, preserved delicacies instead of basic dried fish. He could not bring himself to build a shelter as simple as his neighbors, but he built one nonetheless, and in that compromise between pride and pragmatism, a kind of wisdom emerged. Other wealthy families, hearing about Ivan's near disaster, quietly commissioned their own hidden shelters, though they rarely spoke of them in public. The story of Ivan's roof spread through the frontier network of travelers and traders, carried from settlement to settlement as cautionary tale and practical lesson. Each telling reinforced the fundamental truth that wealth without wisdom was no protection, that the finest materials poorly applied to unforeseen circumstances offered no more security than modest materials used with proper understanding of what they needed to withstand. It became a kind of open secret. The finest homes in the settlement all had underground refuges, but these were discussed, if at all, in euphemistic terms. They were additional storage spaces or cellars or auxiliary structures, never explicitly called emergency shelters, never acknowledged as admissions that wealth could not guarantee safety. This linguistic evasion preserved face while accommodating reality, a very human solution to the conflict between pride and prudence. The wealthy shelters, when they were built, reflected their owners' status in interesting ways. They were larger, of course, with more headroom and more space per person. They were better appointed, with wooden floors instead of packed earth, with proper doors instead of simple hatchways, with stoves or braziers for heat, rather than relying solely on body warmth and insulation. Some even had multiple rooms, replicating underground the spatial divisions of the homes above. But all these elaborations added complexity, and complexity in shelter design is not always advantageous. The more elaborate the structure, the more things that can potentially fail. The larger the space, the harder it is to keep warm with limited fuel. The more comfortable the appointments, the more maintenance required to keep them functional. Simple shelters, built according to Stepan's basic principles, often proved more reliable than their elaborate cousins, a lesson that played out repeatedly across the frontier. There were cases where wealthy families' shelters failed precisely because of their elaborations. The proper wooden door that warped in the constantly changing humidity of underground space and would not close properly when needed. The stove, whose chimney drew poorly and filled the shelter with smoke. The multiple rooms that created airflow problems and cold pockets. Meanwhile, the simple earth shelter, with its crude entrance and minimal amenities, performed exactly as intended, protecting its occupants through brute effectiveness rather than refined comfort. The wealthy also had different attitudes toward winter itself, shaped by their material advantages. For ordinary settlers, winter was an enemy to be endured, a season that had to be survived through careful preparation and constant vigilance. For the wealthy, winter was more of an inconvenience, a constraint on movement and commerce, a time when life became less pleasant but not necessarily threatening. They had enough food to not worry about starvation, enough fuel to keep fires burning generously, enough warm clothing to venture outside without risking frostbite in minutes. This sense of security, while often justified, could also breed a kind of complacency that made them less attentive to subtle warning signs that ordinary settlers had learned to read with precision. When servants, for wealthy families, often had servants, usually families of lower status, who worked in exchange for food and protection, warned about concerning changes in weather patterns, these warnings might be dismissed as peasant superstition rather than valuable local knowledge. When indigenous hunters passing through offered advice about preparing for an unusually harsh winter, based on animal behaviors or plant signs, wealthy families might nod politely and then ignore the advice, trusting their imported weather wisdom or their own past experience rather than knowledge systems they did not fully understand. This dismissiveness had consequences. The indigenous knowledge in particular represented hundreds or thousands of years of accumulated observation, patterns recognized and passed down through generations of people whose survival depended absolutely on reading natural signs correctly. When an indigenous hunter said that the bears were denning earlier than usual, or that certain birds had altered their migration patterns, or that specific plants were producing seeds in unusual abundance, these observations carried predictive power that no amount of imported European meteorology could match, but receiving that knowledge required humility that wealth sometimes obscured. There are records of wealthy families who ran short of firewood because they had not stockpiled as much as experienced settlers recommended, trusting that they could always purchase more from suppliers who might, or might not, be able to deliver through winter storms. There are accounts of families whose stored food proved insufficient because they had calculated based on normal winters rather than worst-case scenarios, an optimism that ordinary settlers could not afford. The wealthy had buffers that protected them from many consequences of poor planning, but those buffers were not infinite, and winter on the frontier was very good at finding and exploiting any weakness in preparation. Yet it would be wrong to characterize the wealthy as simply careless or arrogant. Many were thoughtful, responsible people who took winter seriously and prepared accordingly. Some became students of frontier survival, learning from their more experienced neighbors, adapting their lifestyles to accommodate the realities of the landscape, rather than trying to impose imported assumptions on a place that did not care about assumptions. The best of them recognized that their advantages were not shields against all possible disasters, that winter could kill anyone regardless of status, and they prepared with the same seriousness that Stepan brought to his shelter-building work. These were the families who survived generation after generation on the frontier, who built lasting dynasties in places that broke families of lesser resilience. These successful wealthy families understood something essential, that frontier survival required a particular kind of intelligence that had nothing to do with formal education or sophisticated culture, and everything to do with accurate assessment of risk and appropriate response to danger. They sought out the settlers who had survived the longest, asked questions about their methods, observed how they prepared, and then applied those lessons regardless of whether doing so aligned with the practices they had known in more settled regions. The Orthodox priests occupied an interesting middle position in this social landscape. They were educated men, usually, sent from more civilized regions to bring religion to the frontier's scattered faithful. They had some access to resources through their church connections, often had small allowances that placed them above ordinary poverty. But they were not wealthy by merchant standards, and they lived alongside ordinary settlers, shared many of the same hardships. Their relationship to hidden shelters was pragmatic rather than ideological. If a shelter was available, they used it when necessary, and they blessed shelters for parishioners without judgment about the practice. Some priests kept careful records of births, deaths, marriages, and major events, and these records occasionally mentioned storms and their aftermath, providing rare written documentation of hidden shelter use. One priest, Father Nikolai, who served a parish near the Indigirka River from 1789 to 1817, wrote in his journal about sheltering underground during a storm in 1802. His description is matter-of-fact, mentioning the discomfort and the anxiety, but also noting that he used the time to pray and to contemplate the metaphorical meaning of being buried alive and then emerging into new life, seeing in the experience a reflection of death and resurrection. His was a spiritual interpretation of a practical necessity, finding religious meaning in survival strategy, and his writings suggest that many people on the frontier engaged in similar mental processes, layering symbolic significance onto pragmatic actions. Father Nikolai's journals reveal a man struggling to reconcile his theological training with frontier realities, finding in the hidden shelter a powerful metaphor for the Christian narrative of dying to the old self and being reborn. He wrote of the shelter as a kind of tomb from which one emerged transformed, the darkness and confinement echoing Christ's 3 days in the sepulchre, the emergence into light after the storm passed, reflecting resurrection into new life. The administrators and military officers stationed on the frontier often struggled to understand the population they were nominally governing or protecting. They came from places where authority was clear and hierarchies were respected, where orders flowed down through established chains of command. The frontier did not work this way. Distance and isolation meant that orders from distant capitals might take months to arrive and were often irrelevant by the time they did. Local conditions required local solutions, and the settlers who had survived multiple winters knew more about those conditions than any newly arrived administrator, regardless of his education or official position. This created tensions and occasional conflicts, but it also forced many administrators to learn humility, to recognize that their authority was largely theoretical, and that real power belonged to those who understood how to survive in this place. Some administrators tried to impose order through regulations about shelter building, requiring certain standards or inspecting preparations. These efforts were usually futile. Settlers built shelters according to their own judgment and local knowledge, and no external inspection could determine whether a shelter would actually save lives when storms came. One particularly officious administrator in the 1790s attempted to mandate that all shelters conform to specifications he had drawn up based on military engineering principles, complete with detailed measurements and required materials. The settlers nodded respectfully, accepted his official documents, and then built their shelters exactly as they always had, understanding that the administrator's specifications, however technically sound in theory, did not account for the specific conditions of their location, the materials actually available, or the lessons learned through generations of trial and error. The best administrators recognized this and focused instead on facilitating knowledge sharing, helping to distribute Stepan's instruction boards, or organizing communal work projects where experienced builders could teach less experienced settlers. This was leadership adapted to frontier realities, helping people help themselves rather than trying to control through decree. Winter nights in wealthy households had their own rhythms and rituals, different from but parallel to the experiences of ordinary settlers. When storms came, wealthy families would gather in their innermost rooms, the spaces furthest from external walls, where wind could not penetrate, and cold was most successfully held at bay. They would light beeswax candles, would read scripture aloud by their warm glow, would say prayers for their own safety and for the safety of their neighbors and servants. There was genuine piety in these prayers, mixed with the very human fear that came when wind howled and walls shook, and the darkness outside felt like a living, malevolent presence. Some families developed elaborate storm rituals, specific sequences of prayers and readings and activities meant to pass the time and manage anxiety. Children might be told stories, not frightening tales, but gentle narratives about saints or biblical figures, stories meant to calm rather than stimulate. Adults might play card games or chess, activities that focused the mind on something other than the storm's fury. The matriarch of a household might distribute small treats hoarded for such occasions, preserved fruits or sweet cakes, creating moments of small pleasure in the midst of larger fear. These rituals served practical psychological purposes, giving structure to otherwise formless hours of waiting, but they also reflected the cultural values and social practices that wealthy families brought with them from more settled regions. There was something both admirable and poignant in these attempts to maintain civilization's comforts in a place that cared nothing for civilization, to preserve gentility in the face of nature's raw power. The chess games played by candlelight while storm winds threatened to tear away the roof represented a kind of defiance, an insistence that human culture and refinement could persist even in the most hostile circumstances. But they also represented a vulnerability because the energy devoted to maintaining these cultural forms was energy not devoted to the purely practical concerns of survival, and there were times when that misallocation of attention had consequences. The wealthy also had more complex relationships with servants and subordinates, relationships that winter tested in particular ways. A wealthy family might have several servant families living in separate structures on their property, people who worked the household's land or tended their animals or performed domestic labor in exchange for food and some small degree of protection. When storms came, decisions had to be made about whether servants would shelter in the main house or in their own structures, whether they would be invited into the family's hidden shelter, if one existed, whether they were considered part of the household or separate from it. These decisions revealed much about the character of the family making them. Some wealthy families treated their servants as extensions of their own household, would not consider sheltering separately when disaster threatened, included servants in their emergency preparations as a matter of course. Others drew harder lines, maintained distinctions even in crisis, though this sometimes meant servant families died when their inadequate shelters failed, while the wealthy family they served survived in comfort. The frontier remembered such outcomes, and they affected how families were regarded by their neighbors. A wealthy merchant who let his servants die while he survived was not trusted the same way afterward, not invited into community decisions, not respected despite his wealth. The social calculus of the frontier placed enormous weight on how people behaved in crisis, understanding that true character emerged when choices had life or death consequences. A merchant might be forgiven for sharp dealing in business, might be excused for prideful behavior during easy times, but allowing people under his care to die when he had the means to save them was an unforgivable betrayal of the fundamental obligations that frontier life imposed on those with advantages. Winter exposed character in ways that prosperity could mask, and the frontier's social memory was long. But there were also examples of extraordinary generosity. Wealthy families who opened their homes to anyone who needed shelter when storms came, who shared their supplies freely with neighbors struggling to survive, who used their advantages to strengthen their communities rather than simply insulating themselves. These families became pillars of their settlements, respected not for their wealth alone, but for their recognition that survival on the frontier was a collective endeavor, that individual advantages meant little if the community as a whole did not endure. The best of the wealthy understood what Stepan understood. Winter was stronger than any individual, but intelligent cooperation could create resilience that individual preparation could not match. As the 19th century progressed and the frontier became less isolated, as supply routes became more reliable and settlements grew larger and more established, the differences between wealthy and ordinary households became more pronounced rather than less. Wealth could buy more imported goods, more sophisticated construction, more elaborate preparations. But the fundamental vulnerability remained unchanged. Storms still came, roofs still failed, winter still killed those who were unprepared or unlucky. The hidden shelters continued to serve their purpose across all social classes, used less frequently perhaps as construction improved, but always there, always maintained, always ready. And there was a kind of democratic wisdom in this, a recognition that regardless of wealth or status, everyone who lived on the frontier shared certain basic vulnerabilities, certain needs that had to be met through practical preparation rather than social position. The hidden shelter was a great equalizer, as necessary for the wealthy as for the poor, when storms exceeded all other preparations. In the end, winter cared nothing for wealth or poverty, for status or position. It tested everyone according to the same merciless criteria. Were you warm enough? Was your shelter sound enough? Did you have enough food and fuel to last until the storm passed? Those who could answer yes to these questions survived. Those who could not died, and their wealth or poverty mattered not at all to the cold that claimed them. The wealthy who understood this, who built their hidden shelters and stocked them carefully, and taught their children the paths to safety, survived alongside their poorer neighbors. Those who trusted too much in their advantages, who thought wealth could substitute for practical preparation, sometimes learned through tragedy what Stepan had learned as a 9-year-old boy watching Pavel's frozen body carried past his door. Winter takes everyone it can reach, and only knowledge and preparation can keep you beyond its reach. And so the frontier maintained its strange mixture of hierarchy and equality, where social distinctions mattered for much of the year, but dissolved when storms came and everyone retreated into their hidden places beneath the earth, wealthy and poor alike, huddling in darkness, waiting for the wind to stop, hoping their preparations would prove sufficient, equal at least in their vulnerability and their hope for morning's light. And so we come to the end of our quiet journey, drifting back from those distant winters to this present moment, from the cold darkness of hidden shelters to wherever you are now, warm and safe, listening to these words in comfort that the people we've followed could barely imagine. The distance between their world and ours is measured not just in years, but in the fundamental change of what survival means, what shelter means, what winter means to those who experience it. We have traveled tonight through layers of a single truth, approaching it from different angles, seeing how it shaped individual lives and communities, how it blurred in archaeological mystery and sharpened in class distinctions. That truth is simple but profound. People endure what they must endure, and they do so not through heroism or drama, but through careful preparation, accumulated knowledge, and the quiet determination to see another spring. The hidden shelters of the Siberian frontier were not monuments to human achievement, but testimonies to human vulnerability, acknowledgements carved into earth that sometimes our best plans are not enough, that backup systems and redundant preparations are not signs of fear, but of wisdom. Stepan Alexeyevich understood this at 9 years old, watching a neighbor's frozen body carried past his home, and he spent his life acting on that understanding, building safety into hillsides, one shelter at a time. His work saved lives he never knew about, in storms he never witnessed, for families he never met. This is perhaps the finest kind of legacy, not fame or recognition, but the quiet persistence of useful knowledge spreading and adapting and saving lives long after its originator has returned to Earth. The people who built these shelters, who maintained them through decades of winters, who practiced the paths to safety with their children in darkness, these were not extraordinary people in the conventional sense. They were not heroes of grand narratives or subjects of historical monuments. They were ordinary people facing extraordinary circumstances with the tools available to them. Observation, experience, cooperation, and the willingness to prepare for disasters they hoped would never come. That their preparation sometimes proved unnecessary was not waste, but blessing. That they spent time and labor on shelters they might never use was not paranoia, but prudence in a landscape where the cost of being unprepared was measured in frozen bodies. We who live in centrally heated homes, who experience winter as an inconvenience rather than a threat, who can summon warmth with the touch of a button, we might struggle to fully comprehend what it meant to live as these frontier families lived. Our winters are soft things, managed and controlled, rarely dangerous except in exceptional circumstances. We do not check our roofs daily for structural integrity, do not calculate fuel supplies against worst-case scenarios, do not rehearse escape routes in darkness. Our children do not practice survival skills as routine elements of education. We have insulated ourselves so thoroughly from winter's dangers that the very concept of needing a hidden underground shelter seems almost fantastical, something from a fairy tale rather than practical history. But this distance should not breed dismissiveness or the assumption that those people lived in primitive simplicity while we have evolved beyond such necessities. Rather, it should inspire a kind of respect and acknowledgement that they solved problems we no longer face because they solved them so successfully that we inherited their solutions without having to rediscover them ourselves. Every advance in building technology, every improvement in insulation and heating, every weather forecasting system and emergency response protocol, all of these rest on foundations laid by people like Stepan, who observed what failed and imagined what might work better. The hidden shelters were one answer among many to the question of how to survive in a hostile environment. They were not the only answer, not even always the best answer, but they were a good answer, one that acknowledged reality without surrendering to it, that faced vulnerability with preparation rather than denial. And there is something deeply human in that response, something that transcends the specific historical circumstances to speak to how we, as a species, approach challenges that threaten our survival. We are neither strong enough nor tough enough to simply endure through physical hardiness alone. We are not built for extreme cold. Our bodies lack the insulation that makes winter easy for animals adapted to it. But we have something other animals lack: the ability to learn from experience, to share knowledge across generations, to imagine solutions before crises force them upon us, to build deliberately rather than relying on instinct alone. The hidden shelters embodied all these peculiarly human capabilities. They were products of observation, watching roofs fail and asking what could be done differently. They were products of imagination, conceiving of underground spaces as alternatives to surface structures. They were products of accumulated wisdom, incorporating indigenous knowledge about earth and snow, testing methods through trial and error, refining designs based on what worked and what failed. They were products of community, sharing plans, helping with construction, opening shelters to neighbors in desperate need. And they were products of hope, the belief that preparation matters, that survival is not simply left to chance, that tomorrow is worth the effort of making it more likely to arrive. As you lie there now, perhaps feeling sleep beginning to blur the edges of your consciousness, perhaps already drifting in that space between waking and dreaming, consider for a moment the simple comfort of your situation. You are warm, or at least have the means to become warm readily available. You are sheltered by walls that will not collapse under snow weight. You have light without needing to carefully ration precious oil. You have food without needing to have gathered and preserved it months ago against the possibility of being trapped by storms. You have all of this not through your own effort primarily, but because you live in a time and place where these things have been solved so thoroughly that they require almost no thought. Stepan's descendants, if any survive to this day, probably live in cities with modern heating and well-stocked supermarkets and weather applications on their phones that predict storms days in advance. They probably do not think much about their ancestor, who spent his life building holes in the ground lined with birch bark. The knowledge he preserved and transmitted has been superseded by technologies he could not have imagined. And yet something essential in what he did persists: the recognition that survival requires preparation, that vulnerability should be acknowledged rather than denied, that the work of making tomorrow possible is work worth doing even when today feels secure. These are not lessons unique to the Siberian frontier. They apply wherever people face challenges that test their resilience. They apply in our modern world with its different but still real dangers, its own forms of winter that we must prepare to endure. The specific techniques change, the technologies evolve, but the underlying wisdom remains. Hope for the best, prepare for the worst, help your neighbors, share your knowledge, maintain your refuges, even when you hope never to need them. The families, huddled in hidden shelters during those frontier storms, cold, uncomfortable, afraid, but alive, they embodied a kind of victory over circumstance that deserves recognition. Not dramatic victory, not the kind that inspires stirring music or memorial statues, but the quiet victory of having done the necessary work before crisis arrived, of having thought ahead and prepared accordingly. When they emerged after the storms passed, blinking in the bright light reflected off new snow, stretching limbs cramped from hours in confined spaces, checking to see which cabins still stood and which had fallen. In those moments, they were not heroes congratulating themselves on dramatic rescues. They were simply people relieved to be alive, ready to begin the work of repairing damage and continuing through another day. The archaeological sites that mark where these shelters once existed, gentle depressions in forest floors, collapsed chambers slowly being reclaimed by earth, they are not monuments, but memory traces, physical reminders that people once lived here differently than we live, faced challenges we can barely comprehend, and found ways to survive that worked well enough to carry them through to spring, generation after generation. In time, even these traces will fade completely, filled in by natural processes until no sign remains that shelters were ever carved into these hillsides. And perhaps that is appropriate. The shelters were never meant to last forever, only long enough to serve their purpose, to keep people alive through specific winters, to be there when needed and quietly maintained when not. Their disappearance from the landscape does not erase their significance or diminish what they represented to the people who built and used them. Some things matter most in the moment they are needed, and their eventual obsolescence is not failure but success. The success of having been good enough for long enough that better solutions could eventually replace them. Tonight, as you drift towards sleep, you carry with you images of another time. Snow falling endlessly, wind howling around cabin walls, families making the decision to retreat underground, the darkness of hidden chambers lit by small lamps, the waiting through storm hours that felt endless, the emergence into changed landscapes when weather finally broke. These images are gifts from the past, offerings of perspective on how others lived and what they faced, and how they responded with resourcefulness and quiet courage. Let them settle gently in your mind, not as dramatic narratives that demand attention, but as soft background awareness, the knowledge that human beings have faced and survived challenges far greater than most of us will ever encounter, that survival is often a matter of unsexy preparation rather than heroic response, that the unglamorous work of maintenance and planning and careful thought matters more than we usually acknowledge. Let yourself feel gratitude for the ease of your own circumstances, for heat that requires no constant tending, for shelter that needs no daily inspection, for food security that is assumed rather than constantly negotiated. And perhaps feel also a thread of connection to those frontier families, recognizing in their struggles something universal about the human experience. We all seek safety. We all fear for our families. We all hope tomorrow will come and we will be there to see it. The hidden shelters are mostly gone now, collapsed or filled in, forgotten by all but specialists who study such things. The people who built them are long dead, their names lost except for rare exceptions like Stepan, whose story was fragmentarily preserved. The settlements they inhabited have been abandoned or transformed beyond recognition. The harsh winters continue, indifferent to human presence or absence, storms still raging across the taiga as they always have. But the knowledge persists in evolved forms, the basic insights about preparation and redundancy and community mutual aid. These have been built into modern emergency planning, into building codes and weather prediction systems and disaster response protocols. We live in a world shaped by countless Stepans, people who observed failures and imagined improvements and shared their knowledge freely, whose individual contributions have been absorbed so completely into the collective wisdom that we no longer see them as innovations, but simply as the way things are done. This is how progress actually works, not through dramatic breakthroughs that revolutionize everything instantly, but through incremental improvements that accumulate over generations, small insights that compound into major changes so gradually that the transformation is only visible in retrospect. So rest now. Let the images and stories of this quiet journey settle into whatever part of your mind stores such things. Let the rhythm of your breathing slow, matching the gentle pace we have maintained through these hours of soft narration. You have traveled far tonight without moving, have witnessed lives and struggles from a perspective of safety and distance that allows appreciation without personal danger. You have spent time with people who faced winter's fury with nothing but practical knowledge and determined preparation, and you have seen that this was enough, not always, not for everyone, but often enough to matter, frequently enough that communities persisted and knowledge accumulated and traditions formed. The hidden shelters kept their promises often enough to be worth building. And that is all we can ask of any preparation. Not certainty, but improved odds, not guarantees, but reasonable hope. Close your eyes if they are not already closed. Feel the comfort of your bed, the warmth of your blankets, the security of your shelter. These are not small blessings, though we treat them as unremarkable. They are the accumulated inheritance of countless generations who worked to make survival easier for those who came after them, who built and learned and shared, and slowly, incrementally, created the circumstances that allow you to drift into sleep without fear of freezing, without anxiety about collapsed roofs, without the constant vigilance that frontier life demanded. Sleep well, knowing that others once kept watch through long winters, so that eventually no one would need to keep such watch anymore. Sleep grateful for their efforts and their wisdom and their quiet perseverance. Sleep peacefully in the world they helped create storm by storm, shelter by shelter, winter after winter, until finally winter became a season we could simply weather rather than a threat we might not survive. Rest now. Let history's cold winds blow only through dreams, distant and softened. Let the stories of hidden shelters settle into memory like snow falling gently on a landscape already white. You are safe, you are warm, and morning, when it comes, will find you still here, still comfortable, carrying forward into another day in a long chain of days made possible by all those who prepared carefully, who built thoughtfully, who survived stubbornly, and who passed on their knowledge like the most precious inheritance, the gift of knowing how to endure. Good night.